They called him the Weapon, not for the sword he carried, but for what he kept hidden beneath his armor. And every woman who discovered the truth ran screaming. King Draven Moore stood 7 feet of scarred muscle and absolute dominance, an alpha king whose presence bent rooms into silence. Yet beneath the crown lived a bitter secret. He was a king rejected by every noble woman from the Azure Coast to the Frost Mountains. 23 women in 5 years. 23 rejections. Some fled, some cried. One fainted. Several laughed. They named him the Weapon of Blackwood, not for rage or cruelty, but for a physical nature so overwhelming, so impossibly proportioned, that no woman was brave enough to claim him. A conqueror cursed to stand alone. But tonight the silence of his isolation is shattered. Now, let's return to the moment everything changed. The rain had turned the palace grounds into a treacherous maze of slick stone and shadows. Through the moonlit gardens, a flicker of white cut through the darkness. Ren, an Omega, small and trembling, her cotton-rest orn, ran until her lungs burned. Hunters closed in behind her, men who saw her as nothing more than property. Her breath came in ragged, searing hitches. Her feet were numb, sliced by jagged cobblestones in the lower district, but the sting of the cold was nothing compared to the terror of the chains she had just escaped. She turned sharply into the king's private courtyard, a place where no commoner, especially no runaway Omega, should ever be. Blood smeared the cold stone beneath her as she rounded the fountain into something solid. The impact wasn't like colliding with a man. It was like running full force into a mountain of warm, living stone. The force sent her reeling backward. Her weak legs gave out. She braced for the ground. A hand the size of a dinner plate shot out with cobra speed, catching her by the arm and hauling her upright with effortless, terrifying strength. Ren looked up, and the breath died in her throat. Up the vast expanse of a scarred chest. Up to the amber eyes of the man the world feared most. King Draven Moore. Even in the dim moonlight he was a titan. His chest was bare, scarred from 100 battles, muscles so dense they looked carved from oak. He wore only heavy leather trousers and boots. His long, dark hair clung to his neck in the rain, but it was the sheer scale of him that froze her. The legendary Alpha King, whose presence was said to be so overwhelming that no woman had ever successfully bonded with him. They called him a freak of nature, a giant whose very anatomy was a threat. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely more than air. She pressed her face into his chest and whispered again, broken, desperate, "Please. I'll do anything. Just don't let them take me back." In that moment, the Alpha King realized something he never had before. His massive arms weren't built to be feared. They were built to be her fortress. Draven's amber eyes narrowed. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence did the talking. The air around him grew heavy, charged with a crushing magnetic alpha force, the kind that made people drop to their knees. "There she is." The lead hunter burst into the courtyard, skidding to a halt. To others followed, panting. Restraints clinked at their belts. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. That Omega is a runaway from the Baron Silas estate. She's defective property. Hand her over and we'll be gone." Draven didn't move. He didn't even look at them. His gaze remained fixed on the tiny woman trembling beneath his hand. He felt the frantic rhythm of her heart through her arm, fluttering like a trapped bird. "Property." Draven's voice was a low, resonant growl, a sound that vibrated through Ren's bones. A sound that had sent armies retreating. "Yes, sire," the hunter said, emboldened by the king's cold reputation. "She's gutter-born. Not worth your attention." Ren felt Draven's grip tighten. This was it. He would toss her back like a scrap. Instead, the king stepped forward, drawing her behind him. The movement was like a landslide. He didn't simply walk, he claimed space. His massive frame eclipsed the torchlight, casting a shadow that swallowed the hunter's whole. "This woman sought sanctuary in my house," Draven said, his voice dropping an octave. "In Blackwood, the king's shadow is law. You are standing in it. But sire, the law of ownership. Get off my grounds." The words were quiet, devastating, final. The hunters didn't wait. They fled into the darkness, boots clattering in retreat. Silence reclaimed the courtyard, broken only by the steady rhythm of rain. Draven turned slowly, expecting the usual. He expected her to recoil, to see his size and flee just like everyone else had. But Ren didn't run. She looked at the man who had saved her. She saw the raw power, the muscles too large for any ordinary frame. but she also saw the way he stood slightly turned away, as if trying to make himself smaller, as if he were used to being too much for the world. She took a trembling step closer and placed her small, pale hand over his heart. It beat slow and steady, like a war drum. "I don't see a beast," she said, meeting his gaze with a courage that shook him to his core. "I see a king." For the first time in 10 years, Draven Moore felt seen. Ren woke to softness. It was so foreign, so unexpected, that for a moment she thought she'd died. The bed beneath her was a cloud of silk and down. Nothing like the hard wooden planks of the holding cells. Golden morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a chamber so vast it could swallow her family's entire cottage. Then she saw him. Draven sat across the room in a chair that looked like a child's toy beneath his frame. He'd positioned himself by the door, hands folded in his lap, visible and threatening. His massive shoulders were hunched forward, as if he were trying to make himself smaller. "You're safe," he said, his voice gentle despite its depth. "I give you my word. No one enters these rooms without my permission." Ren pushed herself upright, wincing as pain shot through her feet. The movement drew his attention to her injuries, and something shifted in his expression. "May I?" He gestured to her feet. She nodded, unable to find words. Draven crossed the room and knelt before the bed. The sight was absurd. A king on his knees for a gutter-born Omega. He reached for a basin of warm water and clean cloth, then carefully lifted her foot. His hands were enormous, scarred, and calloused. Yet they moved with impossible gentleness as he cleaned the cuts. Ren's breath caught when she saw his knuckles. A maze of old wounds, some barely healed. "Who hurt you?" The question escaped before she could stop it. His hands stilled. A bitter laugh rumbled from his chest. "Everyone." Eventually, the silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain. Then Ren began to talk. She told him about her family selling her to pay debts, about Baron Silas's trafficking operation, the holding cells, the auctions where Omgeza were paraded like livestock, about the night she'd finally broken free. As she spoke, the windows began to rattle. A low growl built in Draven's chest, his rage barely contained. The very air seemed to vibrate with his fury. Ren placed her hand over his trembling fist. "I'm not afraid of you. I've seen real monsters." He looked up at her, amber eyes full of confusion and wonder. How his voice broke on the word. "Everyone else runs. Because you gave me a choice," she said simply. "Monsters don't do that." Something crumbled in his expression. For a long moment, he simply held her gaze as if memorizing her face. Later, when exhaustion began to claim her again, Draven insisted she rest. He built a careful barrier of pillows down the center of the massive beta wall between them. Then he lay on top of the covers, still fully clothed in his leather and boots, as far from her as the bed allowed. "You don't have to," Ren began. "I do," he interrupted gently. "Sleep, little Omega. You're safe here." She woke once in the deepest part of night. Draven had curled himself into the smallest space possible at the bed's edge, his massive frame folded uncomfortably, one arm angling off the side. He tried so hard to take up less space, to be less, to not crowd her. This powerful man who could crush armies had made himself small for her comfort. Ren felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from fear or pain, but from recognition. She'd spent her life being told she was worthless, too broken to deserve kindness. And here was a king who'd spent his life being told he was too much, too big, too overwhelming to deserve love. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. In his sleep, Draven's fingers twitched, reaching across the pillow barrier as if searching for something to hold on to, something worth protecting. The morning brought raised voices from beyond the chamber doors. Footsteps. The royal council had arrived, and they were demanding answers about the unclaimed Omega and their king's private rooms. Draven's eyes opened, meeting Ren's across the pillows. For the first time, she saw something new in his expression. Determination. Before the council arrived, Draven told her the truth. They sat in his solar as dawn broke over Blackwood, and he explained what the history books carefully omitted. His bloodline traced back to the first Alphys, a line that bred true and strong. Too strong. Everything about me is disproportionate. The words came out rough, laden with shame. The healers measured when I came of age. They said no Omega could. His jaw clenched. He couldn't finish. Ren studied him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. Did they ask what you wanted? Her voice was sharp, clinical. Or did they just tell you that you were wrong? Draven's head snapped up. In all his years, no one had ever questioned the healer's verdict. No one had ever defended him. The moment shattered when the council doors burst open. Lord Vesper led the procession. Draven's cousin and the man who'd been circling the throne like a vulture for years. Behind him came a dozen council members, their faces twisted with righteous indignation. And among them, draped in silk and spite, was Lady Kareen, rejected bride number 17. This is an outrage, Vesper declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. An unclaimed Omega in the king's private rooms. The scandal alone. Lady Wren sought sanctuary, Draven interrupted, his voice dangerously calm. Which I granted. Sanctuary? Kareen's laugh was cruel. Is that what we're calling it? I've seen what that monster hides beneath his careful. Draven's single word made the windows frost. But Kareen pressed on, emboldened by the council's presence. She described in vivid, humiliating detail the night she discovered the truth about Draven's proportions. How she'd screamed. How she'd fled. How no woman could possibly endure such a monstrosity. Elderly Elder Fane's head began to droop, his snores punctuating Kareen's theatrical testimony. Furthermore, Vesper continued, we've received documentation from Baron Silas. This Omega is contracted property. She must be returned immediately. Wren had been silent, sitting small in her borrowed dress, but at those words something inside her snapped. She stood without permission. You're all cowards. The room fell silent. Even Elder Fane's snoring stopped. You stand here discussing property rights and scandal while ignoring the real monstrosity. Her voice shook but didn't break. Baron Silas runs a trafficking ring. He buys Omgaza like livestock. And you? She turned to Kareen. You dare call this man a monster? He could have let them take me. Instead, he gave me a choice. He knelt to tend my wounds. He made himself small so I could feel safe. She looked at Draven, seeing the shock in his eyes. The only monster I see in this room is your judgment of a man whose only crime is being different. She speaks above her station, Vesper snarled. Remove her. No. Draven rose, and the sheer presence of him made Vesper step back. Lady Wren is under my protection. As my ward. Anyone who touches her answers to me. The words hung in the air. In 5 years, the king had claimed no one. Protected no one. These words were a declaration that shifted everything. That evening, Draven found Wren in his private garden, hidden behind high walls where no one could see. She sat among the night-blooming jasmine, arms wrapped around herself. They're right, you know. His voice came from the shadows. I am too much. I've seen the fear in every woman's eyes when they discover. Wren stood and crossed to him. Before he could react, she took his massive hand and pressed it to her throat. Her pulse fluttered against his palm like a hummingbird. Show me this monster they see. His hand trembled violently against her skin, the hand that could snap her neck like kindling. I could never. His knees buckled, and suddenly he was kneeling before her. This giant of a man, brought low by the simple act of being trusted. Wren knelt with him, their faces level in the moonlight. I know, she whispered. That's the difference between you and them. They see size. I see restraint. They see power. I see control. She placed her hand over his heart. They see a weapon. I see a man who's forgotten he deserves to be held. That night, for the first time in his life, Draven allowed himself to hope. When Wren fell asleep in his bed, he held her carefully, as if she were made of spun glass. And in the darkness, he whispered secrets he'd never told anyone. About the loneliness that had carved him hollow. About the nights he'd prayed to be smaller, normal, acceptable. She stirred in her sleep, pressing closer to his warmth. And Draven finally understood she wasn't running towards safety. She was running home. Wren woke to the rhythmic sound of hammer striking steel. She found Draven in the private courtyard, shirtless in the morning sun, working the forge. It was therapeutic, he'd explained once. The only place where his strength was an asset, not a curse. She watched from the colonnade as he shaped glowing metal, each movement controlled and precise. The restraint was visible in every stride, every careful breath. He was a man who'd learned to hold back his entire life. He caught her staring and reached immediately for his discarded shirt, self-consciousness flickering across his face. Don't. The word came out stronger than she intended. You're beautiful. His laugh was disbelieving, almost bitter. But when he met her eyes and saw only truth there, no fear, no disgust, just honest admiration, the laugh transformed into something else. Wonder. Fragile. Tentative hope. That night, he finally told her about the 23. They sat in his chambers as the fire burned low, and he recounted each rejection. Bride number 4 had run screaming. Number 9 had fainted. Several had laughed cruelly, as if his body were a cosmic joke. The worst was number 12, who'd called him deformed and spit at his feet before fleeing. I stopped in resting after the 8th, he said, his voice hollow. Just told them. Saved everyone time. Ren felt fury and heartbreak warring in her chest. They didn't deserve you. They deserved someone who could. No, she grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. They deserved exactly what they got. Nothing. Because they were too blind to see what was right in front of them. 3 nights later, Ren was in the library researching ancient alpha biology. Frustration finally boiled over. I don't understand how they couldn't see. See what? Draven's voice came from the doorway, rough with something unreadable. She turned and the words tumbled out before she could stop them. That you're trying so hard not to be loved that you've forgotten you deserve it. The space between them evaporated. She didn't know who moved first, only that suddenly his hands were cupping her face with impossible gentleness, and her fingers were angled in his hair. The kiss was desperate and tender, a collision of hope and fear and something deeper than either of them had words for. When they finally broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers, breathing hard. I've never, his voice cracked, I've never kissed anyone who stayed long enough. Ren pulled him closer, and for the first time Draven allowed himself to believe this might be real. The next morning, he found her on the balcony and looked so formal she almost laughed, until she saw his hands shaking. I can't offer you normal, he began, clearly rehearsed. I can't promise it won't be difficult, but I can promise that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of. She kissed him silent. Yes, she said against his lips. I haven't asked yet. His whisper was broken, vulnerable. Her smile bloomed through tears. Yes. Anyway. He laughed, truly laughed, and lifted her off her feet, spinning her in the morning light. For one perfect moment, the world was nothing but possibility. The moment shattered when Advisor Hale burst onto the balcony with urgent documents. Saw them kissing and backpedaled so fast he tripped over a footstool. I saw nothing, Your Majesty, he shouted, fleeing with his papers flying. Ren buried her face in Draven's chest, shaking with laughter. He joined her, the sound rumbling through his chest like thunder. But in the shadows of the palace, Lord Vesper watched from a high window, his jaw clenched with rage. Beside him, Lady Corrine smiled like a knife. She's made him weak, Vesper said. Good, Corrine replied. We kings are easy to destroy. That night, they met in the old wine cellar beneath the palace where the stone walls kept secrets. On the table between them sat a vial of clear liquid and a detailed plan that would end with the Beast King dead and the Omega blamed for his death. The victory feast is in 3 weeks, Vesper said, studying the poison. When he drinks this, the Alpha rage will be uncontrollable. And when they find her body, the kingdom will demand his execution, Corrine finished. And I'll take the crown to restore order. They sealed their conspiracy with a toast, unaware that in the chamber above, Draven was sliding a heavy gold ring onto Ren's finger and promising her a future neither of them knew was already under siege. The messenger arrived at dawn with news of border raids, northern villages burning. Draven's presence was required immediately. Ren found him in the war room, already armored, studying maps with his generals. He looked up when she entered, and the professional mask cracked. I don't want to leave you. You have to. She crossed to him, placing her hand over his breastplate where his heart thundered beneath. You're their king before you're mine. I'm yours first, he said fiercely. Always yours first. In the courtyard, his warhorse stamped impatiently. Draven pulled her close one last time, breathing in the scent of her hair. Come back to me, she whispered. Always. He slid a heavy gold ring onto her finger, his mother's betrothal ring, ancient and precious. Wait for me. She watched him ride through the gates until he was nothing but a distant shadow against the morning sun. 2 days later, Ren found herself lost in the palace's old wing, searching for the East Library. The corridors twisted like a maze, tapestries covering walls that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. That's when she heard the voices. The beast finally found someone desperate enough. Vesper's bitter tone was unmistakable, coming from behind a faded tapestry depicting ancient battles. Ren froze. Kareen's cruel laugh followed. Not for long. The poison wine at the Victor feast will trigger alpha rage, something that potent, combined with his nature. When they find her body torn apart, no one will question what he is, and the kingdom will demand his execution. Vesper finished. I'll take the crown to restore order. The Betel Ein was always stronger anyway. Ren's hand flew to her mouth, smothering her gasp. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering so loud she was certain they'd hear it. She ran. Advisor Hale believed her immediately. The old advisor had never trusted Vesper, but he had no authority to act without proof. And every messenger Red Ride to send was mysteriously delayed or redirected. Maeve paid them off, Hale said grimly. Every rider, every carrier bird. The feast is tomorrow night. Draven returns at dusk. The timeline crashed over Ren like ice water. Tomorrow, the victory feast celebrating the ended border conflict. The wine. The poison. Draven's death. I have to reach him before he returns, she said. The northern camp is a day's hard ride through the Thornwood forest. Hale protested. You'd never make it in time. And the forest is my only option. She tried the stables first. The young stable boy listened to her request, then stared at her as if she'd sprouted wings. Begging your pardon, lady, but you want to borrow the king's warhorse to ride through the Thornwood at night because you've had a prophetic vision of danger. His expression suggested he was reconsidering his career choices. Ren realized too late that her panic had made her sound like a court lunatic. Never mind. Midnight found her slipping through the servants' entrance in borrowed clothes, her feet barely healed and wrapped in stolen bandages. The Thornwood forest stretched before her like a dark ocean, ancient and hungry. She thought of Draven's hands, gentle despite their strength, his laugh in the morning light, the way he'd learned to hope because she taught him how. I'm coming, she whispered to the darkness. The forest swallowed her whole. Behind her, the palace slept, unaware that its queen-to-be was racing through the night toward a man who didn't yet know his wife hung by a thread. Above, the moon disappeared behind clouds, and the Thornwood came alive with sounds that hadn't been heard in generations. The forest at night was hungry. And Ren was alone. The widow's ravine earned its name from the women who'd fallen to their deaths crossing it at night. Ren stood at the edge, looking down at the treacherous path carved into sheer cliff face, barely visible in the darkness. She thought of Draven's hands cleaning her feet with impossible gentleness, how carefully he touched her, as if she were precious. She started down. The path was slick with moss and loose stone. Twice her feet slipped, and twice she caught herself on jutting rocks that tore her palms open. Blood made everything slippery. Her wrapped feet screamed with each step, old wounds reopening. Come back to me. Always. Her whispered mantra kept rhythm with her heartbeat. Come back to me. Always. She reached the bottom as the ravine opened onto the dark creek. The ice broke beneath her third step. Cold, bone-deep, breath-stealing cold swallowed her whole. Ren's lungs seized. She clawed toward the surface, dragging herself onto the bank with arms that no longer felt like her own. Hypothermia crept through her blood like poison. You're not worth this trouble, Draven's voice. But wrong, cruel, a hallucination born of cold and fear. Why would I want someone so broken? No, she forced herself to her knees, then her feet. He chose me. He chose me. She stumbled forward into the deeper forest. The wolves found her an hour before dawn. Ren heard them first. The patting of paws, the low growls of a pack scenting blood. Her blood. She looked up. The nearest tree was an ancient oak, its lowest branch barely within reach. She jumped. Pain exploded through her hands as she caught the branch, her wounded palms screaming. She pulled herself up with strength she didn't know she possessed, climbing higher as the wolves circled below. They paced and snarled, waiting. Ren clung to the frozen branches, shaking so violently she thought she might fall. She thought of Draven's laugh, the way he'd spun her in the morning light. His broken whisper. I've never kissed anyone who stayed long enough. I'm staying, she told the darkness. I'm staying. Dawn came slowly. The wolves melted back into the forest shadows. Ren dropped from the tree. Her legs nearly buckled. She could barely stand. Her feet left bloody prints with every step. She ran anyway. The forest began to thin. Through the trees, she saw the northern road. And on it, Draven's hunting party. He rode at the front on his massive warhorse, his generals flanking him. They were heading back to the palace. To the feast. To the poison wine. Ren found strength she didn't possess. She burst from the tree line onto the road, her final sprint leaving a trail of crimson behind her. Draven. His head snapped up. He saw her broken, bloody, barely standing. And his roar of anguish shook the forest itself. Ren. He was off his horse before it stopped moving, catching her as her legs finally gave out. His hands, those massive, gentle hands, cradled her against his chest. What happened? Who did this? I'll kill. Poison, she gasped, each word agony. The wine at the victory feast. Vesper and Kareen. They'll trigger alpha rage. They'll kill you and blame me. Her vision was blurring. She felt herself slipping away. No, no, stay with me. Draven's voice cracked. Ren, stay. Always, she whispered. And then there was only darkness. Draven's face transformed. The fear bled away, replaced by something colder, sharper, controlled fury that made his general step back. Double speed to the palace, he commanded, his voice like winter itself. No stops. No mercy for anyone who slows us down. He lifted Ren's broken body into his arms and mounted his horse one-handed, cradling her against his chest. As they rode, he pressed his lips to her forehead and whispered promises to her unconscious form. Promises about conspirators who would learn the difference between a beast and a king, about a reckoning that would shake the palace to its foundations, about all of that would survive anything, even betrayal, even poison, even death itself. You ran through the thornwood for me, he murmured, his voice breaking. Now watch me burn down anyone who dared to threaten us. The hunting party thundered toward Blackwood, carrying a king who'd finally learned that the greatest power wasn't in his strength. It was in being loved enough that someone would bleed themselves broken just to save him. The palace healer worked in grim silence, cleaning wounds that spoke of impossible determination. Ren's feet were shredded, her hands torn, her body trembling with exhaustion in the aftermath of hypothermia. Draven sat beside the bed, massive frame rigid, his face a mask of terror barely contained. When her eyes finally opened, he released a sound between a sob and a prayer. The wine, she rasped immediately. Hale switched it. Poison that triggers. I know. His shaking hands cupped her face with infinite care. You ran through the thornwood for me. You would have done the same. No one has ever. His voice broke. He couldn't finish. Couldn't articulate that in 30 years of life, no one had ever risked themselves for him. No one had ever chosen him over their own safety. I know, she whispered, understanding everything he couldn't say. He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in, reassuring himself she was alive. When Waven finally stood and stepped into the hallway, his advisors took one look at his face and backed away in instinctive fear. The alpha energy rolling off him could have leveled the palace. Your Majesty, Advisor Hale said carefully. The alpha is perfectly restrained. Draven's voice was winter itself. Because unlike my cousin, I know the difference between strength and violence. The advisors stared. They'd expected rage, expected destruction. Instead, they got something far more terrifying. Absolute control. Within the hour, a war council assembled in Draven's chambers. Ren insisted on being present despite her injuries. Propped up with pillows, bandaged feet elevated. We let them think the plan proceeds, Draven said, his strategic mind already 3 steps ahead. The wine gets switched with harmless liquid. We position witnesses throughout the hall. People they can't bribe or intimidate. We could just stab them, Sir Rory C. offered helpfully. We're trying to prove we're civilized. Rory C. Hale shot back. Ren bit back laugh that turned into a wince. They wanted to prove I'm a beast, Draven continued, his amber eyes hard. I'll prove I'm a king. The council dispersed as night fell, leaving them alone. Draven carefully lifted Ren's bandaged feet into his lap, his touch impossibly gentle. I've spent my whole life afraid of my own body, he said quietly. Afraid of my strength, my size, my everything. But you ran yourself bloody trying to save it. Your body isn't the problem. Her voice was fierce despite her exhaustion. Their fear is. and I refuse to let their fear kill the best man I've ever known." Draven was silent for a long moment. Then he slid from the chair to kneel beside the bed, taking her hand in both of his. "Ren, I asked you once already," terrified and stumbling over words. "Let me ask you properly." His voice steadied, formal and beautiful. "Will you be my queen? Will you stand beside me and teach this kingdom that love isn't about fitting perfectly together? It's about choosing each other despite every reason not to." Tears streamed down her face. "Yes, always. Yes." The kiss was gentle, flavored with salt and promise, and the fierce determination of two people who'd both been told they were too much or not enough, finally finding home in each other. "Tomorrow," he murmured against her lips. "We end this. Together," she corrected. "Together." That night, Ren slept wrapped in Draven's arms, safe and warm, and in the great hall below, servants prepared for a victory feast that would become something else entirely. Vesper and Kreen arrived early, wearing smiles sharp as knives, confident in their conspiracy. They watched the wine being placed at the king's seat, unaware it had been switched hours before. They watched witnesses, loyal nobles, honest soldiers, even common citizens, filing into the hall under the guise of a public celebration. They watched their perfect plan proceeding exactly as designed. They had no idea they were walking into a trap set by a king who'd finally learned his greatest weapon wasn't his strength, it was his restraint. The great hall filled with bodies and anticipation. The feast was about to begin, and justice, long overdue, was finally coming home. The great hall blazed with torchlight and anticipation. Every noble family, every council member, every soldier who'd served in the northern campaign filled the ancient space. Guards stood at strategic positions, loyal men hand-picked by advisor Hale. Ren sat beside Draven at the high table, bandaged feet hidden beneath her gown of deep crimson, his colors. She'd insisted on being present despite the pain, and he hadn't argued. They were in this together. Vesper and Kreen sat 3 seats down, their faces masks of false celebration. But Ren saw the gleam in their eyes, the barely contained anticipation. They kept glancing at the ceremonial chalice placed before Draven's seat. The feast began with military precision. Courses came and went. Finally, as tradition demanded, the victory wine was brought forward in an ancient silver chalice passed down to generations of Blackwood kings. Vesper rose, raising his own cup. "A toast," he announced, his voice carrying across the hall. "To my cousin, the king, who once again proves that strength prevails. To family, to loyalty, to Blackwood." The hall echoed the sentiment. Draven lifted the chalice, its weight familiar in his massive hand. The room fell silent, breath collectively held. His amber eyes locked on to Vesper's across the table. A smile, cold and knowing, touched his lips. "To family," Draven said softly. "Mate raiders receive what they deserve." He hurled the chalice. Wine exploded across Vesper's shocked face, the silver vessel clattering to the stone floor. The hall erupted in gasps and confusion. Ren stood, pain lancing through her feet, but her voice rang clear and unwavering. In her hand, she held a small vial of clear liquid. 3 nights ago, I overheard Lord Vesper and Lady Kreen plotting murder." She placed the vial on the table. "This poison, placed in the king's victory wine, was designed to trigger false alpha rage. When my body was found torn apart, the kingdom would demand Raven's execution, and Vesper would take the crown." The palace healer stepped forward. "I've tested the original wine," Lady Ren speaks truth. "This poison would have been fatal and framed His Majesty as an uncontrollable beast." "Lies," Vesper snarled, wind ripping from his face. "The word of a gutter-born Omega is worth more than yours," Draven interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. He stood, and the sheer presence of him silenced the hall. "You wanted to prove I'm a beast. Let me show you control instead." Every muscle in his body was taut with fury, but his hands remained steady. His voice never rose. The alpha energy radiating from him should have shattered windows, but he held it leashed tight. "Seize them," he commanded. Guards moved immediately. Vesper struggled, shouting accusations. "You're too dangerous to rule. Everyone knows it. You're a freak, a monster. I spent 10 years at war." Draven's response was devastating in its calm. "I've killed hundreds in battle, but I've never once hurt someone who trusted me. That's not danger. That's discipline. Something you clearly lack." Corinne screamed as guards took her arms. He's a monster. You've all seen what he is. No woman can endure. The only monstrous thing here, Wren interrupted quietly, is wasting this good man's time on your jealousy. The hall exploded into applause. In the back corner, elderly Elder Fane jerked awake from his nap. Did I miss dinner? He shouted, looking around in confusion. Despite everything, Wren laughed. Draven joined her, the sound rumbling through his chest, genuine and free. As guards dragged the conspirators away, Draven took Wren's hand. The entire hall could see the way he cradled it gently, as if she were made of starlight. My people, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner. Meet your future queen. The woman who ran through the Thornwood to save my life. The woman who saw a king when everyone else saw a beast. The applause became a roar. That night, as peace finally settled over Blackwood, Draven and Wren stood on their private balcony, watching the celebration spill into the streets. What happens now? She asked. He pulled her close, careful of her healing feet. Now, we plan a wedding. A wedding? She repeated, smiling. I suppose the kingdom will have opinions about that. The kingdom, Draven said, pressing a kiss to her temple, can learn what we already know. Love isn't about perfection. It's about finding someone who sees you, truly sees you, and chooses you anyway. Below, the city celebrated their king's victory, but in the quiet of their chambers, they celebrated something far more precious. Being known, being chosen, being finally, impossibly home. Peace settled over Blackwood like the first snow of winter. Soft, transformative, long-awaited. Wren woke to the familiar sound of hammer striking steel. She made her way to the balcony, her feet finally healed, and watched Draven working shirtless in the private courtyard below. He moved with a freedom she'd never seen before, no longer trying to make himself smaller, no longer apologizing for the space he occupied. He looked up and caught her watching. For the first time since she'd known him, his smile came easily. No hesitation. No self-consciousness. Just joy. Are you going to propose properly? She called down. Or should I do it? His laugh rang out full and genuine, echoing off the courtyard walls. You're terrible for my dignity. You know that? Your dignity will survive. That evening, he found her on their favorite balcony overlooking the kingdom. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and crimson. Draven wore formal attire, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. He knelt. Actually knelt. This massive king choosing vulnerability, choosing to meet her at eye level. 23 times I tried to give this ring away, he began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Desperate for anyone to take it. I thought something was wrong with me. That I was too much. Too different. Too impossible to love. He took her hand gently. But it was always meant for you. The one who ran toward me, not away. The one who saw a king when everyone else saw a beast. Tears streamed down Wren's face. I'm going to need you to actually ask before I say yes this time. His voice broke on the words. Wren, will you marry me? Will you be my queen? My partner? My home? Yes, she pulled him up, throwing her arms around his neck. Always. Yes. The kiss under the stars was everything. Tender and passionate, filled with promise and possibility, untainted by fear or shame. Just to people who'd been told they were wrong, finally finding right. The next weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Wren stood in the royal fitting room surrounded by seamstresses as they pinned and tucked her wedding gown. She'd insisted on practical modifications. Hidden pockets. She explained to the head seamstress, who looked increasingly concerned. Deep enough for small vials. May I ask why? My lady? Emergency wine vials. You know, in case anyone tries to poison my husband at our wedding reception. The seamstress's face went through several expressions before settling on uncertain. You're joking. Yes? Wren's smile was enigmatic. Am I? Elsewhere in the palace, Draven's mother's crown was being resized. The kingdom buzzed with excitement. Citizens planning celebrations, nobles ordering new finery, children practicing throwing flower petals. The night before the wedding, tradition demanded they sleep separately. Wren lay in the guest chambers, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. A servant knocked softly, bearing a note sealed with the royal crest. I'm terrible at sleeping alone now. You've ruined me. She laughed and immediately penned a response. Could see you at the altar, your majesty. In his own chambers, Draven weighed her reply and felt something he'd thought impossible just months ago. Giddy, uncomplicated happiness. He pressed the note to his chest like a lovesick boy and didn't care who knew it. Tomorrow he would marry the woman who taught him that being different wasn't the same as being wrong. That eyes didn't determine worth. That love wasn't about finding someone who fit perfectly. It's about finding someone who chose you, scars and all. Again and again. Outside their windows, the city prepared for a royal wedding unlike any in Blackwood's history. Not because of the pageantry or the guest list, but because it would celebrate something revolutionary. To people society had deemed unworthy, proving that the only opinion that mattered was each other's. The wedding day dawned bright and clear. The sky impossibly blue. In separate chambers, Draven and Wren prepared to stand before their kingdom and speak vows that would redefine what it meant to be strong, what it meant to be loved, and what it meant to be enough. The great plaza had been open to everyone, nobles and commoners, Alphas and Omgaza, anyone who wished to witness history. Draven stood at the altar in formal ceremonial armor, polished until it gleamed like starlight. Advisor Hale stood beside him, adjusting his own formal robes. "Still time to run," Hale murmured with a slight smile. Draven's response was immediate. "Where would I go? She's everything." The processional music began. The crowd fell silent. Wren appeared at the plaza's entrance, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Her gown was simple ivory silk that flowed like water. She wore his mother's crown, ancient gold catching the sunlight. And her feet deliberately, defiantly were bare. The crowd gasped at her bravery, her beauty, her absolute refusal to be anything but herself. Draven's vision blurred with tears. This woman, this impossible, perfect woman, was choosing him. Choosing them. She walked toward him with steady steps, her smile radiant. When she reached the altar, he took her hands in his, dwarfing them completely. The priestess began the traditional vows, but both bride and groom had additions. Draven's voice rang clear across the plaza. "I vow to never let my strength become your cage. I vow to hold you gently, love you fiercely, and spend every day earning your trust." Wren's response made the priestess dab at her eyes with her sleeve. "I vow to see you clearly, always. Not the monster they imagined, not the king they crowned, but the man who made himself small so I could feel safe, and to remind you that you never have to shrink again." The priestess was openly crying now. "By the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may." Draven didn't wait for permission. He lifted Wren carefully, mindful of her healed feet, and kissed her with everything he had. Tender and passionate. A promise and a celebration. Untainted by fear or shame. The crowd's roar of approval shook the plaza. He pulled back just enough to whisper against her lips. "My queen, my home, my king, my king." She whispered back. The celebration that followed would be remembered for generations. Dancing filled the plaza as nobles mixed freely with commoners. Elderly couples renewed their own vows of commitment. Young lovers found courage in the king and queen's example. Draven danced with Wren, and despite his size, he moved with surprising grace. He spun her carefully, and her joyful laugh carried across the square like music. As sunset painted everything golden, Sir Rory C., thoroughly drunk on celebration wine, stood on a table and shouted, "I told you we should have just stabbed them." Advisor Hale physically dragged him away while apologizing to nearby nobles. Evening found the newlyweds on their private balcony, the kingdom still celebrating below. Fireworks were being prepared for midnight. "Do you think they finally see you?" Wren asked, leaning against the railing. Draven pulled her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her. "I don't care what they see anymore. You see me. That's enough." She turned in his embrace, taking his massive hands and placing them on her waist. "Show me gentle." His touch was reverent, worshipful. After 30 years of being told his body was wrong, he finally allowed himself to hope it could be right. For her, with her. Their kiss deepened as the first fireworks exploded above them, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Wren pulled back, her voice soft but certain. "They called you a weapon, but I knew the truth. You were a man who'd learned to hold power without wielding it, and that made you the strongest person I'd ever known. And you," he murmured, "were the woman brave enough to teach me that strength and gentleness aren't opposites. They're partners. Like us." As fireworks continued to bloom overhead, they held each other. To people the world had deemed wrong, proving that the only truth that mattered was the one they'd written together. True strength isn't the absence of power. It's the choice to control it. And love isn't about finding someone who fits you perfectly. It's about finding someone who sees you completely. 6 months later, the council chamber buzzed with activity as Ren's expanded Omega protection laws passed with overwhelming support. No longer could anyone be bought, sold, or contracted as property. In the training yards, Draven worked with young alphas, teaching them discipline and control. Your strength is a gift, he told them, but only if you learn to master it, not be mastered by it. That evening he found Ren in the garden, visibly pregnant, one hand resting on her swollen belly. He knelt before her as he often did now, without shame, and spoke softly to their child. Your mother ran through a forest to save me, he said, his massive hands gentle on her stomach. She taught me that being different doesn't mean being wrong. I hope we can teach you the same. Ren's fingers tangled in his hair as she looked down at him with complete love. We will. The final image, their hands intertwined, his engulfing hers, both wearing wedding rings that caught the fading light. Their laughter echoed through the garden as the sun set over Blackwood, painting their future in shades of gold and promise. You had just listened to the moving story of the Titan King and his little bird from the Moonlight Mates Library. Draven and Ren proved that true strength isn't about power, but restraint, and that the most perfect love often comes in the most unexpected forms. If you were touched by how Ren ran through the Thornwood to save her king, please hit that like button. Do you think the world judges people too harshly on their appearance? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more heartwarming romances. Until the next chapter, sweet dreams.